Hello, welcome. We are Jason and Debbie Grigla. I'm a parent coach, and Jason is a therapist of 20 plus years, and he is also the executive director for Techie for Life.
We're excited to be here with you. I'm a therapist, Debbie's a parent coach, but more importantly, we are parents of two young adults who are neurodivergent and who we have helped transition into adulthood, and that's been a long journey. We also started Techie for Life about 7 years ago, and we've got a lot of experience that we've learned in the last 7 years that we want to talk about today. So we're excited to be here to present to you, and when we're done, we're going to have a great discussion. So thanks for joining us. So the trends in neurodiversity right now are that neurodiversity is the whole field of different brains, including neurotypicals. The discussion and the culture is that there is those who are a part of all brains, which is neurodiversity, and then the neurodivergent is the term that they're liking to use now, that I'm neurodivergent. Not that I'm neurodiverse. Everyone's got their own brain, but that's kind of an interesting trend that's kind of come out lately. And there's a lot of aspects to the neurodiversity field and culture that are changing, crystallizing, and growing, and different voices are coming out. And so I just wanted to discuss a few of those things. The next thing is that autism, how someone identifies as autistic.
Yeah, the trend used to be person first. I'm a person with autism. But actually now the trend is to own it, to say, this is part of who I am, and I'm not ashamed of it. It's not a bad thing. My brain is just different. So they like to be referred to as autistic, and they are autistics, if you said it in plural. So that's a little bit of a trend.
I'm an autistic, not an autist, which is a little bit different verbiage. So I would share that with you as well.
They don't have one for ADHD, but I know they're looking at it. So that's the trend moving that way. And then just the whole neurodivergent umbrella is kind of changing and probably not solidified yet.
Not at all. That it's not final in any way. And so we have two spectrum graphs here at the bottom on the slides. One is autism spectrum disorder on the left, and you'll see that it has a whole bunch of physiologically different neurodevelopmental disorders labeled, and on the left they don't include bipolar, but on the right they include bipolar. On the left they have anxiety, but on the right they don't include anxiety. But generally speaking, up until just recently, the DSM and the ICD, they didn't have neurodevelopmental disorders as a diagnosis until just the last the last publishing of the DSM-5, for example. So under a neurodevelopmental disorder, we have things like autism. And our presentation today is going to be to kind of compare and contrast the differences between a developmental disorder and how to support that and mental health disorders, and why it isn't working as well to have a mental health approach to a neurodevelopmental disorder.
Okay. So traditional approaches to neurodiversity, it's been counseling typically for older and those with less of an intellectual disability in conjunction with it. So the typical approach is with counseling.
It's it's been Asperger's previously, and the more intellectually capable they are, the more they end up having symptoms like anxiety and depression because they're neurodivergent, stuck in a typical world. They're the metaphorical square peg being pounded into the round hole. And so they end up with mental health issues and diagnoses. As a matter of fact, those who are neurodivergent are 3 to 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with a mental health disorder than the normal population. And then that's not a surprise, obviously. But the less obviously disabled someone is, the more likely they are to just be put into a mental health bubble and into the mental health pipeline. And especially with how well the mental health culture has gone in the IECA and the NATSAP type fields and cultures and families, there's a large mental health approach. every psych eval that we read, almost everyone has, they need individual counseling intensive, they need family counseling intensive, and then they need medications, which we'll talk about in a second. And what we're finding is that our neurodiverse kids and our own kids, that we had to do counseling, and we did family counseling, we did everything we could to remedy the crises that we were in, and it was so ineffective. Insight therapy was not helpful. So
yeah, and it sets up, and this is one of the challenges and problems with it, is when they're going to counseling, it's not actually addressing the developmental issues that come with their developmental diagnoses, and it can set up a feeling of I'm broken and shame around it because they're not getting the successes from those treatments that maybe the typical brained population is getting, and so it sets up a shame spiral and
as a therapist, we end up naturally knowing that they're not going to have a lot of insight, so we do more coaching and more directive, like motivational interviewing, maybe solution focused approach, and then we send them away, and then they come back a week or 2 weeks later and they haven't been capable of doing what we've talked about, what they want to do, which they wish they could do to meet their needs and to start dealing with their depression and their anxiety, and they end up coming back feeling like not even therapy works. I'm really broken. So the traditional approaches to neurodiversity include medications, and I think we have some really good experience with that as well as parents.
I mean, it has its place. It was very helpful when our boys were younger to have them on medications for the attention issues and some of the mood challenges and the behavior impulse control aspects, but it wasn't actually getting to the cause or the heart or what was causing all of that. It was a small piece that helped. It took a little bit of the edge off, but like again, focusing on symptoms does not actually address what they actually really need support for with their developmental
Far too often we see medications applied for dealing with behavior, and behavior's just an outcome of where they're at and who they are and what they're feeling and thinking, and so once again it can be a good help and support, but it is still a mental health approach or a pharmacological approach, and it can't be the only support and intervention. It does focus just on the symptoms. For example, we have a lot of parents that say, well, I needed my kid on ADHD medication. Yes, he's autistic or he's just ADHD, but at the same time, they're developmentally lagging far behind their peers, and there's a constant daily struggle to keep up and even learn. And it's not that they can't focus. Attention deficit disorders, we know that most of our kids, especially if they're neurodivergent, they can have obsessive focus. The problem isn't that they can't focus most of the time, it's that they only focus on what's interesting in the moment and then they want to move on, or they stay obsessively focused all the time. So I don't know how well ADHD works anyway for a lot of our students. So
you mean medication?
Medications, I'm sorry. Yeah, my bad. So when we talk about the traditional approaches to neurodiversity in general, now that there's an actual diagnosis for neurodevelopmental disorders, it's time to start having discussions about what are neurodevelopmental interventions.
Yeah, so with younger children especially, you're going to see like occupational therapy and ABA, which is applied behavioral analysis, and these are typically suggested for kids that are younger and have more of an intellectual disability along with their developmental diagnoses, developmental disorder, but these are very skills-based, performative, task-oriented, external motivational approaches that have some benefits, and there's actually a lot of pushback on some of these, especially with ABA, that the approach and the way they go about it is actually doing more harm than good in the long run.
Yeah, the autism community tends to feel like ABA is stealing my uniqueness and my identity, and it's forcing me to become a square peg or a round peg in a round world instead of letting me be authentic, the authentic person.
And it's actually a really triggering kind of topic. It's along the lines of COVID vaccine discussions in
So
some of the autism communities. So it's good to be aware of that and to understand that little piece. It's typically with the younger, but then there is still that a lot of behavioral approaches happening for neurodivergent adolescents, and the problem with that, and you see it over and over, especially when they become young adults, is there's minimal brain change. It's this external motivator. It's not actually helping them develop the skill sets to be able to do it.
Yeah, so if we're looking at accomplishments, then you can say, wow, I got them their diploma in high school. That doesn't mean they're developed to be able to go into adulthood at all.
Or get a job or do...
Yeah, or we got them to get a job, or we got them to say their ABCs. If we get them to, we're already lost. Because there's nothing sustainable about an external change in behavior. And I think most programs know now that behavioral approaches don't work, and yet mental health programs and approaches haven't been working all that well either, because it's been really hard for a therapist to go walk with their client and do the things that they need to do. For example, in a treatment setting, there's absolutely a need for insight and stabilization and finding the right medications, but that doesn't fix any of the actual problems. That just removes the crises to some extent, but it doesn't meet any needs. And so I think that's what we're going to talk about more than anything else today.
Yeah. So a neurodevelopmental diagnosis has a long history, like these disorders do, but they have not been included in previous editions of the ICD or the DSM. And the term applies to a group of disorders of early onset that affect both cognitive and social communication development. And they're multifactorial in origin, and they have a chronic course with impairment generally lasting into adulthood. So this isn't something you just that comes and goes.
It's not going to be fixed with counseling, for example.
Yeah.
So when we talk about neurodevelopmental interventions, the longest standing evidence-based intervention that we have is actually mentoring. It's not CBT, it's not psychoanalysis, it's mentoring. It's been there forever. And when we apply something that we call neurodevelopmental mentoring, it's about adding another person to partner with the mentee, and they end up building a relationship for development, not treatment, and not to get them to do actions, but to become. So the goal is a physiological change in the brain, which results in the attributes or the qualities of being capable, mature, resilient, having self-efficacy, building an identity. Our brains are basically a meat computer, and at the attachment conference I recently went to, the same type of trauma that our students experience who are neurodiverse, because they're neurodiverse and they get left out, picked on, neglected, even abused, treated poorly because they're different, causes a whole nother level of issues. And then the third level of issues is that they learn to not like themselves, that they're broken, to quit caring about relationships or accomplishments or developmental stages, because it's been such a negative experience. So basically they shut down, they go into a limbic state, which we'll talk about actually in a minute. Mm-hmm. But when someone is 18 and they've been in crises since they were 13 because of social, emotional, and developmental struggles, not much development has gone on, and it's really common that they hit a plateau and they stop progressing. And so, when you start to do mentoring and filling in those developmental gaps, then through mentoring and someone walking with them so that they have that safety and that emotional regulation, we believe in co-regulation is a really great way to think of partnering and mentoring. We're going to talk more about that, but mentoring with someone there instead of just talk therapy or medication is the most effective way to maximize success and minimize the weaknesses in any type of neurodivergent struggling situation. And just to go back to the identity, you can be autistic without having an intellectual disability. You can just be quirky and still autistic. So what they like to say is, don't say higher functioning, lower functioning, autistic, because they're offended by the fact that you assume that because I'm autistic, I have an intellectual disability, and that's not accurate. I might not have the same sense of humor. I might like things that you don't like. I might be developmentally delayed, but I'm not disabled. The disability comes if there is an intellectual
well, they do own the disability of it, but just because someone would be labeled as higher functioning doesn't mean that they aren't struggling and experiencing things that they're maybe just better at, like masking it, or
so they almost think it cheapens to say higher functioning, because hey, just because I'm higher functioning doesn't mean it's not really all I can do to just survive.
Right.
So some of them really do know that they struggle.
So it's still being in psych evals, like different levels sometimes, but as a community and like removing shame and really understanding these diagnoses, there's a move and a push to label.
Which makes it hard, because I need to know how much support someone needs. So I like the levels 1, 2, and 3, but the autism community is pushing back on that. So
yeah, so we want you to be aware of that trend that's happening. So factors in neurodevelopment. We know that neuroplasticity and growth will happen. You can't do the same behavior or the same activity and be the same person doing it. You're always growing or changing, or it's a little bit different each time you do something. And so it's really important to recognize that it's not...
Nobody's stuck,
and it's actually experiences and not time that are the major impetus for growth and development. So if I'm, say, stuck in the basement gaming 24/7 and that's all I do, and I do that for 10 years, I'm not getting 10 years of development happening, right? I'm doing the same activity and I'm kind of stuck in that same place.
Yeah, I want to go back to the growth will happen part. It seems like with some of them, it feels like, but they've hit a glass ceiling and they aren't growing. They're just growing less, but there is a point where I think most people will hit their glass ceiling of ability if they have a neurodivergent diagnoses. In some areas, they're going to hit a glass ceiling. We don't really know what they are, and it's really important to recognize that and just assume that their brain will change. There's two things that happen when we have an experience. We have an immediate reaction as a person, how we think about it, how we feel about it, what we do about it, but then the brain also has a shift in some way to prepare for the next time it happens. And those are the two things that the brain grows with, and neuroplasticity is related to. So I love that we don't talk about how old you are, we talk about experience.
Yeah. And it's really helpful to think too about how development is incremental, and meaning that stages, you can't skip stages. You can't jump from one developmental stage and leap up to another just because you're at a different age, right? So we have to build on things. You can't usually you can't learn to walk unless you've practiced crawling, right? So there has to be some foundational muscle development and skill development, eye-hand coordination, all these things going on that build for the next level of, okay, now we're walking, okay, now that gets practice, and now we're running. It's the same thing with social skills and coping and resilience and self-advocacy and all of those other pieces. There has to be foundational.
So an example of that would be if we have a student who's ready in their parents' minds because they're 19 or 20 and they're ready for a job, but they've never had a group of friends to just goof around with, a job's going to be a major failure and problem because they haven't had the high school experience yet. So you might have to go back and redo some of those milestones and overcome some of the roadblocks. So they have to be ready to take the next step and want to. It needs to be an internal motivation. But for that to happen, they have to be in a good limbic state. And
yeah, so when we're looking at mentoring, one of the key things to happen is the person that you're working with, that you're trying to help, they cannot be in a fight, flight, freeze, trauma brain, limbic system response, right? That's like survival mode, and that's not the logical part of our brain. And so the work of a mentee, like the work of a mentor is to help them get into a safe state of mind where they can actually, you can tap into their logical part of their prefrontal cortex, and that's where actual skill development happens. That's where neurodevelopment is really going to happen.
Not because they're comfortable and stuck, but because they're okay.
I'm okay, I'm not in danger.
I'm okay, and I want to grow, instead of I'm in crises and I'm about to drown, which means they're not thinking clear. And we're actually trying to develop actual neural pathways. Development isn't just choices of what do I do. A lot of our students can do good things, but then they can't consistently do it because the neural pathways aren't there to continue to do something that they were excited about last week, but they aren't excited about it this week. And it was the excitement maybe that made them capable of it for a short time.
Yeah. So to be able to get them out of that triggered limbic, panic, I'm not safe state, their basic needs have to be getting met. Especially as they become adolescents and young adults, their social and emotional needs and attachment and connection and belonging are critical to their development, is to get them and to calm that limbic, stress response down. They've got to get those basic needs met. And that is a primary focus when you're looking at interventions for neurodivergent young people.
If they're getting close to getting out of high school and moving into independence, even if they're not there yet, the problem is that we see most often is being at home is a trigger. And the frustration and the stress the parents are feeling rubs off on the atmosphere and the student, and then the student reacts poorly, and so it just becomes a cycle where just because, and they know, hey, I'm 18, I get to do what I want, or I'm 16, I should be able to go drive even though I'm not ready, or I'm 21, why are you making me drive when I don't want to? And there's just a lot of dissonance between those.
And parents can't meet those social pure needs that adolescents and young adults have. Parents have a place, but there is that real need to be able to go out in the world. You've got to be able to get along with peers and belong with people outside your family circle.
That's a developmental necessity. I need my peers to think I'm doing well and I'm enough, so that I know that I'm enough, because my parents don't count anymore. Yeah. So some of the things that work in mentoring is the relationship of influence, and that's what we call it when we build enough of a relationship where the mentee values our input and our influence in their life. And it's totally different than a power differential where one's above and one's below. But if there's a deep relationship where they value the influence, then change occurs, fears go down, their limbic system is calmed, balanced, and this is kind of a longer term thing. It can't happen in 3 months usually. It's usually at least a year to do any type of a successful mentor-mentee relationship. And so using any type of external have-tos, ought-tos, musts, shoulds, need-tos, punishments is obviously not effective to anybody, but especially to this population. To start where they're at and to work on what they want instead of what they should is really critical.
And all those shoulds, that pressure, that actually triggers that limbic response where they're not safe, because there's judgment there, and there's I can't measure up and I'm not able to do it, and the pressure of it. So that actually creates a lot of stress for them on top of what they're already trying to navigate. So being able to practice and work with mentors and be in an environment where they can safely practice different skills and be able to banter, be able to, lead something or be a part of planning something, or just all the different activities and things that adolescents and young adults start to get involved in.
It's not about did I get you to go on a date. It's about were you ready to go on a date, and did you want to, even though you were afraid, because it met a need that you wanted, and we helped you walk with that. So we're at 24 minutes. We need to keep going pretty quickly. We got a few more.
Here we go.
So some of the nuances that we want to think about, and we want you to think about in a shift from a mental health approach to a neurodevelopmental mentoring approach, is to let them be where they're at and like what they like. That doesn't mean it's okay when you're 24 to pull the Legos out on the table if you're with a bunch of college kids and you want to be friends and make friends and fit in. It's important to learn that you're probably going to alienate yourself. but there needs to be a safe place where they can go be themselves, almost like you're putting on an astronaut suit to go out in the typical world, and then you can come home and take off your astronaut suit and be refueled and nurtured back in your home base.
And to recognize that takes some energy. That can be...
It's a sacrifice, but it's
right?
worth it if you want to make friends, right?
As they're trying to fit in, but then also be them. So this one, I love this. Jason just came up with this recently. We were trying to describe this, but it's really an idea of letting them act their stage, not their age. Like really understanding that what stage they're at, what that looks like. So for example, if we've got a kid that has been in kind of a outcast, struggled in school and didn't have any friends, and then they get into an environment where they do have some friends, they're going to look like a junior high kid joking inappropriately or taking it too far, or because they're not good at it. But that's actually really developmentally stage appropriate for where they're at to see that kind of behavior. And we recognize that in an adult program with kids that are sometimes at 12, 13, 14.
An 18-year-old acting like a 12-year-old, being too rough, throwing things too hard, trying to banter way too rough or personal.
Or awkward or,
or
cringy.
And that's a way better swing than no swing at all. So that's appropriate.
Yeah. So you're going to see the swings going because that's how, junior high kids act.
So we don't look at what's appropriate for a 21-year-old to do. We look at what's the next step developmentally for wherever they're at in their development stages. And then the last one, and is probably the most important because we're more similar than dissimilar, is that everyone needs belonging to progress. Development only occurs in our mammal human stage when we belong to a group. And I don't care what they say, they may not need as much social as someone else, but our students and our children are just as social as anyone else. They just don't know how to do it well sometimes, or they've been burned so many times they back off and pretend they don't need, but they all need to belong to the
And an introvert is going to still need close, maybe
friends,
not as many, not as much, but they're still going to need some deep, close relationships.
So removing the pressure to do, but focusing on what do they want, even if it's buried. I know they want to date, but they're like, no, I don't want to date. Then we start working on that and picking at it. And then we always start with not assuming that they won't, but that they can't. That means that this is an ability issue, not a defiance oppositional issue.
Yeah. And what's big too is, as usual, we want to always have unconditional positive regard. We want to stay curious, compassionate, and connect before we try to do any kind of correction or feedback.
Yep.
That's fundamental to be able to hear it and to receive it and to actually utilize it, right?
And then for development to occur, they actually do have to be out of their comfort zone place, but not overwhelmed. And there's that brain growth place right in the middle of, I need something to be different for brain change to occur, but I can't be overwhelmed or the brain shuts down and goes into fight or flight mode.
Yeah. And then ultimately, if you're not doing your punishments and rewards and these external motivators, it's really about creating an environment where they want to move forward, they want to do things instead of feeling like they have to or doing it out of obligation or other people's expectations.
And that's what counseling does. But then counseling can't go with them and walk with them. And I think that's the second part of being a mentor, not a therapist, and not just a coach that cheers them on, but someone that walks with them and says, well, let's go do that together. Let's text that girl back, or let's get on a dating website. Yeah.
So we're coming close to our recorded time here. We have some resources. We have a free resource, a podcast that we put out weekly called Autism and Neurodiversity, with Jason and Debbie, on all the typical podcast formats. And we put that out as a free resource for parents and professionals, and we want to share things we're learning through the work we're doing here at Techie for Life and in coaching we do. And
it's not a marketing piece. It really is just trying to add value to this area that we are passionate about. And I think there's a lot of good information on there for parents who don't know how to navigate this situation, because there's just not a lot out there yet. Not a lot of good information. Yeah.
So we want to offer that to you, and you can go to our website, jasondebbie.com, for that free resource. And then you can also email me at debbie@techieforlife.com.
If you want these notes, they might be here for IECA. I don't know if we're going to download them. But they're also, you can email Debbie and ask anything you'd like. So,
well, thanks for being here, and then we're going to jump onto the
we have
live.
some great discussion questions, so stick around. I want to hear what you think.